They told you angels were pale, blonde, and blue-eyed, like they came straight out of a shampoo commercial. They told you heaven looked like Northern Europe, golden gates, white clouds, white robes, white wings. But what if I told you that's not how the first artists, the first prophets, or the first believers saw them? What if the angels of God were not pale spirits floating in clouds, but black guardians standing in light, dark skin shining like bronze and fire, wool-like hair glowing under the sun? See, they sold us a picture, but they didn't sell us the truth. The first time I saw a medieval painting of a black angel, I stopped breathing, not because it was strange, but because it felt right. You know that deep pull in your chest when something hidden finally makes sense? That's what it felt like. Centuries of whitewashed art had convinced us that purity meant pale, but the oldest icons, the earliest scrolls, the ancient walls of Ethiopia and Nubia tell a different story. They tell a story of angels who looked like us. Before the Renaissance repainted heaven, Africa had already drawn it. They lied to you. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is they used our own history to do it, because the image of the angel, the messenger between heaven and earth, it didn't start in Rome or Greece or Europe. It started in Kemet, in Kush, in Axum, long before a European brush ever touched a canvas. The winged guardians, the divine messengers, the beings of light and flame, they were carved in obsidian and gold on African soil. They wore the same crowns as our pharaohs. They spoke the same languages as our ancestors. But somewhere along the line, somebody realized, if you control what heaven looks like, you control who feels worthy of it. That's the betrayal. Think about it. You walk into any church in the Western world, and what do you see? White cherubs, pale saints, a European Jesus, a European Mary, and an all-white choir of angels floating above them. But travel back through the centuries, past Michelangelo, past Da Vinci, and you'll find something else. Ethiopian manuscripts with dark-skinned archangels, Coptic icons with brown faces, haloed in gold, early Christian mosaics in North Africa showing winged protectors darker than the night sky. They told you angels don't have color. Funny, because they sure took the time to repaint them. Why? Because image is power. You ever notice how every time they show you divinity, it doesn't look like you? That wasn't an accident. That was a strategy, a centuries-long PR campaign to make sure that God looked like them and not like you. Because if God looks like them, then who do you pray to? Who do you trust? Who do you obey? The truth is, the oldest Christian nation on earth isn't Rome. It's Ethiopia, the Ark of the Covenant, said to rest not in Europe, but in Axum. The oldest images of Mary and Jesus, brown, the angels who protected them, black. And yet we were told this history didn't exist. But it does, hidden in monastery vaults, painted under layers of white plaster, sitting in museum basements, labeled anonymous African art. They call it anonymous when they don't want to admit who made it. You know what's wild? Even the Bible gave us hints. We just never looked close enough. In Daniel 10:6, the prophet describes an angel whose arms and feet were like polished bronze. In Revelation, Christ's skin is compared to burnished brass, refined in a furnace. That's not ivory, that's not marble, that's melanin, that's fire-baked brown skin, shining with divinity. But they told us to read it metaphorically. Polished bronze doesn't mean dark. Oh, the hair like wool is just symbolic. Man, if you gotta twist every line to keep it pale, maybe the truth ain't on your side. What if heaven always looked more like the motherland than the mother church? What if those glowing halos weren't about whiteness, but light itself shining through brown skin? See, they don't erase to destroy, they erase to replace. Every time they painted over a brown face with ivory, they weren't just changing color, they were rewriting connection. They were saying, you don't belong here, you didn't build this, you don't come from heaven, you come from dirt. But the dirt they talk down on, that's the same soil that grew creation. Africa is not the footnote of faith, it's the birthplace of it. Ask yourself, Why would they hide that? Why would the Vatican collect black icons from Ethiopia and never display them? Why would European scholars spend centuries describing Negro features on ancient saints, then quietly stop publishing those drawings? Why would the angels of the Bible, the ones described in fire, bronze, and lightning, suddenly become blonde? Because if they can make you forget that heaven once looked like you, they can make you doubt that you ever belonged there. And that's how you break a people. But we're here to stitch that truth back together, piece by piece, painting by painting, scripture by scripture. Because once you see the real faces of the angels, you start to realize this story was never about skin color, it was about power. The question is, who had the power to rewrite heaven? And what were they so afraid you'd see if the wings were black? Let's get one thing straight. Lies don't last this long without help. The erasure of black angels wasn't a mistake. It was a campaign, a cover-up so deep it reached into cathedrals, museums, and the very pages of the Bible itself. They didn't just hide images, they hid sources. They buried the receipts in plain sight, under layers of Latin, mistranslation, and interpretation, because they knew if the people ever found out who the first saints and angels really looked like, the whole illusion would crumble overnight. See, history wasn't written by the victors, it was rewritten by the editors. Back in the earliest days of Christianity, Africa wasn't some distant mission field, it was the center. Alexandria, Egypt, was the beating heart of theology. Nubia was home to Christian kingdoms before Europe could even spell cathedral. Ethiopia was preserving gospels centuries before Rome even approved its own Bible. That's not an opinion, that's documented fact. But when the Roman Empire made Christianity its brand, things changed. Suddenly, the same people who used to worship African gods were remixing African stories, just with new faces. The brown saints of the desert became pale mystics of the Mediterranean. The angels once carved on Ethiopian scrolls, broad-nosed, full-lipped, radiant, were corrected to look European. It was the first case of divine identity theft. You ever wonder why so many of the early church fathers studied in Egypt, or why the word angel itself, melak, melakim, came through Afro-Asiatic tongues? Because Africa was the blueprint. They didn't invent divinity, they inherited it. Now here's where it gets deep. When archaeologists began uncovering early Christian art in Nubia and Axum, they found murals of winged figures with dark brown skin, curly hair, and African garments. These weren't caricatures, they were reverent portraits. In the 6th century, Church of Abraha and Atzbaha in Tigray, Ethiopia, the walls are filled with angels painted in deep ochre and red-brown pigments. Their eyes are wide, their hair coiled, their wings covered in gold leaf. You look at them, and you can't deny, that's us. That's African divinity, right there in paint, older than half of Europe's churches. But the scholars who discovered them, they went quiet. They described the art as primitive or symbolic, never admitting what they were really seeing. Because to say those angels were black would mean saying that heaven's messengers were African, and that's a truth the West wasn't ready to process. And the crazy part? They kept our records, but locked the doors. Hidden deep inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church are manuscripts older than any Bible you've ever held. The Kebra Nagast, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. These texts tell stories of angels descending not in Jerusalem or Rome, but in the highlands of Africa. In the Book of Enoch, a text banned from the Western Bible, the Watchers, those mighty angels who descended to teach humanity wisdom, are described with fiery skin and faces that glow like burning metal. Sound familiar? That burnished bronze from Revelation didn't come from Europe, it came from here. But when the Roman Church decided which books to include, guess which ones they left out? The ones that didn't fit the European narrative. Anything that placed divine encounters on African soil, erased. Anything that gave color to heavenly beings, omitted. Anything that suggested God's messengers weren't pale, forgotten. Ask yourself, why would the same empire that murdered Christ suddenly become his spokesperson? Because religion, in the hands of power, becomes a weapon. The Roman Empire didn't adopt Christianity to worship. They adopted it to control, to unite their empire under one image, one God, one book, one face. And that face looked suspiciously like Caesar. They couldn't conquer Africa's spirit, so they colonized its image. Every time they painted a blonde angel, it wasn't just about race, it was about ownership. It was their way of saying, God is ours now, heaven is ours, the message is ours, and anyone who doesn't look like us needs our permission to enter. But the receipts didn't disappear, they just got dusty. From the catacombs of Nubia to the illuminated manuscripts of Ethiopia, the evidence still whispers. The angels of the early church looked like the people of the Nile, dark, majestic, and unashamed. The prophet Moses, raised in Egypt, the Queen of Sheba, from Ethiopia, Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross, described as a man of Africa. The very foundation of Christianity sits on African shoulders. Yet, when we open the Sunday school books today, not a trace. They tell us it doesn't matter what color they were, but if it didn't matter, why'd they change it? That's the question that burns, because the truth isn't just historical, it's psychological. Once you control how heaven looks, you start to control how you see yourself. That's the hidden source of every whitewashed painting, every European angel, every pale Messiah. It wasn't about faith, it was about frame of mind. So let's follow the evidence. Let's open those sealed books, because every erased image has a shadow, every silence has an echo, and the closer we get to those echoes, the clearer one truth becomes. The image of God was never supposed to be colorless. It was supposed to be us. But if that's true, if Africa's fingerprints are all over the Bible, then who took the brush and painted us out? Let's cut straight to it. The erasure wasn't random. It was targeted. You can trace it, line by line, brush by brush, through art, scripture, and empire. Every correction, every restoration, was really a replacement. They didn't lose the black angels, they removed them. You want receipts? Let's talk receipts. In the 1960s, French archaeologists uncovered wall paintings in Pharos Cathedral, Nubia, a 7th century church buried under sand for over 1,000 years. When they brushed it clean, what appeared on those walls stopped the whole dig. Rows of angels, not pale, not European, but black, deep brown skin, African features, regal wings. These weren't slaves or servants, these were divine protectors. But when those images were moved to European museums, they got cleaned, paint lightened, details softened. Suddenly, those black angels looked a few shades closer to European saints. Coincidence? Never is. And the Book of Enoch, the one that described angels as beings like fire and metal, Ethiopia preserved it. The Western Church banned it. Why? Because it placed divine revelation in African hands. It described Enoch, great-grandfather of Noah, not as a European patriarch, but as a man who walked with God on the same soil where Africa's civilizations were rising. That text threatened the Roman monopoly on holiness, so they called it heresy. It's the same playbook every time. If an image or story made Africa look divine, it was reinterpreted. If it placed Africans near God, it was apocryphal. If it proved African literacy or spiritual authority, it didn't exist. And let's talk art, because art tells the truth history books hide. When early Christian art spread through Egypt, Nubia, and Axum, saints were painted in every shade of brown. The archangel Michael, one of heaven's mightiest warriors, was almost always dark-skinned in those depictions. But move forward a few centuries into Europe, suddenly Michael's got flowing blonde hair and porcelain skin. They didn't just change his color, they changed his context. He went from protector of the oppressed to patron of empires. That's not theology. That's marketing. Even the oldest icons of Mary and Christ tell on the system. The Black Madonnas of Europe, dark-skinned statues and paintings of Mary and baby Jesus, were everywhere from Poland to Spain to France. But when Europe rewrote its holy art, they labeled those images soot-darkened. They said, "Oh, it's just candle smoke." Man, how much candle smoke do you need to turn white marble into mahogany? They knew exactly what those statues represented. echoes of the African mother and child, the same sacred image that came from Isis and Horus. And the museums? They're the crime scene. Thousands of black icons and manuscripts sit hidden in their archives. Ethiopian gospels stolen during the British invasion of 1868. Nubian frescoes quietly filed away. Labels reading unidentified artist. They know exactly who painted them. They just don't want to say it out loud, because to admit it means admitting that the foundations of Western faith, its angels, saints, and saviors, came from African hands and African minds. You ever ask yourself why every Bible you grew up with skips certain books? Why the Book of Wisdom, Maccabees, Enoch, and Jubilees barely show up? Those are the African books, the ones that link heaven, earth, and ancestry through African geography. When Ethiopia built its canon, it included them all. Rome trimmed them out like inconvenient truths. That's not religion, that's revision. And the motive, simple: power needs purity, and purity needs a color scheme. By painting heaven white, Europe gave itself permission to rule the world in God's image. Colonization wasn't just about gold and land, it was about identity theft. If they could convince the world that holiness looked European, then blackness automatically meant sin, savagery, or servitude. That's how art becomes a weapon. But the missing pieces didn't vanish completely. The cracks still show. Every now and then, one slips through: an old manuscript, a mural, a saint with unmistakably African features. They can cover it up, but they can't erase pattern. Because once you see one black angel, your eyes adjust. You start spotting them everywhere. They can't hide what's already in the DNA of creation. And that's the real story. Not just what they erased, but why they were so desperate to erase it. Because if Africa was first in civilization, in scripture, in spirit, then Europe's entire story of divine superiority collapses. The white angel was never history, it was branding. So the question becomes, if the angels were black, the prophets were African, and the first holy books were written in African tongues, then what else did they repaint? Before there were kings in Europe, there were gods in Africa. That's not myth, that's archaeology, language, and legacy. You can date it, you can map it, you can touch the stone, the oldest temples, the earliest written words, the first laws, the first mathematics. All of it rose from black soil, the same soil that gave birth to the idea of divine messengers. Angels didn't fall from Europe's sky, they rose from Africa's earth. Let's put it plain, civilization didn't start in Africa. Civilization is Africa. Go back to Kemet, ancient Egypt, and you'll find the prototype for every later image of divinity. Winged goddesses like Maat and Isis, symbols of truth, balance, and protection, spreading their feathered wings across the pharaohs. That's the origin of the angelic form. Not Europe's painters, Africa's priests. Thousands of years before the Bible ever said angel, African artists were already painting wings on their protectors. And these weren't pale, soft cherubs. These were black guardians, fierce, radiant, alive. Then go south, to Nubia, the land Europeans tried to write out of Egypt's story. Nubia had queens, the Kandakes, who ruled armies, commanded nations, and carried their gods into battle. They called themselves children of the sun. Every temple, every pyramid, carved with divine messengers who looked like them. Brown skin, coiled hair, gold wings, angels before the word existed. Now, when Greek philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato came to study in Egypt, they weren't discovering new ideas, they were borrowing. They took Africa's spiritual science, its math, its geometry, its metaphysics, and gave it European names. The same concepts that described gods and messengers in Africa became philosophy in Greece. That's how you steal wisdom and call it discovery. Europe didn't teach Africa. Africa taught the world. Even the Hebrew scriptures, the ones that would form the Bible, were shaped by African influence. Moses was raised in an Egyptian palace. Joseph ruled under an African pharaoh. Jesus spent his early years hiding in Egypt. You don't run to a place that looks nothing like you. You run where you blend in. That's not symbolism, that's logistics. And the deeper you dig, the clearer the pattern gets. Ethiopia, the nation that still keeps the Ark of the Covenant, practiced Christianity before Rome even converted. The Ethiopian church used Ge'ez, one of the world's oldest written languages. They didn't get the gospel from Europe. Europe got it from them. But every time Africa showed it was first, Europe rewrote the headline. When they saw the pyramids, they said aliens must have built them. When they saw the Nubian kingdoms, they said Egyptian influence. When they saw the Moors light up Europe, they said Muslim invaders. Every explanation except the simplest one. Africa didn't need to borrow brilliance. It was brilliance. You ever notice how every golden age Europe had was built on something Africa already mastered? The Greeks studied in Egypt. The Romans stole Egypt. The Renaissance rediscovered what Africa never forgot. It's the same pattern. Steal the wisdom, bleach the faces, rebrand the story. But history leaves fingerprints. In the ruins of Axum, you'll find crosses older than the Vatican's. In Timbuktu, you'll find libraries full of black scholars writing astronomy and theology centuries before Europe's universities opened. In Benin, you'll find bronze sculptures so advanced that 19th century Europeans couldn't believe Africans made them. So they said lost technology. You know what's really lost? The truth. Because every time they dug up Africa's greatness, they buried it again, under doubt, distortion, and racism dressed up as scholarship. They said Africa had no history until Europe arrived. Yet the world's first city, Hierakonpolis, was African. The world's first written language, Medu Neter, African. The world's first gods with wings, African. The world's first universities, African. Every first that mattered came from the same soil they called savage. And here's the plot twist. Those same African symbols, wings, halos, light, became the blueprint for Europe's angelic art. They didn't just borrow the image, they borrowed the meaning. The idea that messengers of God carry light, protect truth, and defend justice, straight from Maat, Isis, Horus, Anubis, and the rest of Africa's pantheon. They just changed the names and lightened the skin. So when you see a painting of a white angel holding a sword, ask yourself, who's really holding the sword of truth? The artist, or the ancestor they copied? Because if Africa was first, if every winged protector and divine messenger was born on black land, then the whole hierarchy flips. Europe wasn't the source, it was the echo. That's what they've been afraid of. The moment we remember Africa was the beginning, their divine authority ends. Because if the first angels were black, then maybe the first gods were too. And that means the real question isn't, was Africa first? It's this: who changed the story, and why? Let's be clear. History doesn't erase itself. Somebody holds the brush. Somebody turns the page. Somebody decides who gets remembered and who gets rewritten. And when it came to angels, saints, and salvation, that somebody was Europe. But it wasn't just about faith, it was about control. When Rome took over Christianity, it took over the narrative of heaven itself. Think about that. A whole empire that once crucified Jesus now claimed to speak for him. Overnight, a religion of liberation became a tool of domination. Because Rome saw what Africa had: faith, knowledge, art, and spiritual authority, and realized that was the real gold. They couldn't conquer Africa's spirit with swords, so they did it with stories. First, they took ownership of the holy books. By the time the Council of Nicaea rolled around in 325 CE, a bunch of European bishops, not prophets, not apostles, sat around deciding which books stayed in the Bible and which got tossed. Enoch, gone. Jubilees, gone. The Book of Wisdom, trimmed. Every text that connected divinity to African soil, erased. And they didn't stop there. They redesigned the faces too. The earliest icons, painted in Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, showed saints, prophets, even Christ himself, with brown skin and African features. But once Rome made religion its brand, the painters changed palettes. Melanin disappeared under marble. Angels went from bronze to blonde. The divine became European. and the European became divine. You see how slick that is? That's psychological warfare. Because if you make God look like yourself, then every other face starts to look less holy. Every darker shade becomes fallen. Every brown face becomes something that needs saving. That's how you take faith and flip it into power. Europe didn't spread Christianity, it franchised it. When colonialism came, the same playbook repeated. Missionaries painted white angels on African walls. They handed black children Bibles where every divine being looked European. They told them, "Be humble, be obedient, be thankful that we brought you God." But what they really brought was amnesia. They sold salvation and collected souls, not for heaven, but for empire. Look at how it worked. The same countries that enslaved Africans were the ones spreading the gospel. Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, preaching with one hand, chaining with the other. They used the Bible like a contract. You pray, we profit, because if you convince a people that God doesn't look like them, they'll stop looking for God inside themselves. That's the game. And who profited most? The church, the crown, the colonizers, the art dealers and scholars who discovered African relics, sold them, and wrote books about them without naming their creators. They turned Africa's sacred into Europe's collectible. You ever notice how all the great discoveries of African art and scripture happened after Europe ran out of its own originality? The Renaissance wasn't born out of divine inspiration. It was born out of rediscovery of African geometry, African anatomy, African divinity. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, they all studied Egyptian art. They saw blackness in those temples and turned it into whiteness on canvas. They didn't invent the divine image. They stole it, softened it, and sold it. And that's where the prophet came in, because every white angel painted meant one more justification for colonization. Every pale Christ meant another reason to civilize the heathens. Every blonde Saint Michael slaying a dark demon was propaganda. Holy racism in oil paint. It told the world light skin equals good, dark skin equals evil. Heaven looks like us, hell looks like you. They weaponized color to justify conquest. And if you think that's exaggeration, look at their receipts. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull, a church order, giving Portugal permission to enslave Africans for the service of God. Read that again. Enslavement, sanctified, kidnapping, baptized. They called it saving souls, but those souls were working the mines, building the ships, dying for European profit. Faith became a franchise, and Africa was the raw material. And when enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, they brought their own understanding of divinity, their orishas, their ancestors, their angels with dark faces and fiery wings. But those were demonized, rebranded as witchcraft, voodoo, heathenism. The same spiritual traditions that predated the church by thousands of years were suddenly evil. Why? Because they couldn't let black divinity exist outside of white approval. That's what whitewashing really means. Not just changing color, but changing context. The European church needed a monopoly on holiness, so they scrubbed the art, rewrote the scripture, redefined the word holy to mean European approved. That's how you steal a people's power without ever touching their weapons. You rewrite what heaven looks like. The deeper you look, the more you realize none of this was random. It was all infrastructure. The printing press spread the pale image of Jesus across continents. Cathedrals commissioned paintings that made whiteness the visual language of purity. Colonial schools rewrote history so completely that black children grew up believing they were descendants of darkness. And it worked for centuries, until the cracks started showing, until historians started finding those banned books, until archaeologists started brushing the sand off the faces of angels who looked nothing like the ones in stained glass, until the African diaspora started to wake up, connect the dots, and see the pattern for what it was. That's why they panic when we ask questions, because if Africa didn't just witness the divine, but defined it, then Europe's whole religious economy falls apart. The power shifts, the money dries up, the lie unravels. That's the real reason they changed the story. It wasn't about art. It wasn't even about race. It was about control of the soul. Because if you can convince billions that heaven looks like you never have to share earth. But there's still one deeper layer, one that goes beyond politics and profit. Because even after rewriting the story, repainting the faces, and colonizing the world, Europe still couldn't rest. They feared something ancient, something Africa had always known. That light isn't born in whiteness, it's born in fire, and Africa's always burned bright. So the question becomes, what terrified Europe so much about Africa's light that they tried to turn it into shadow? You can steal gold and lose it. You can conquer land and get overthrown. But if you conquer the mind, you own generations. That's what they understood. Europe didn't just whitewash art to make angels look familiar. They did it to build a world where whiteness itself became sacred, where the divine image wasn't just painted on walls, but etched into the subconscious. Every statue, every stained glass window, every children's Bible illustration was a seed. And those seeds grew into beliefs that shaped empires, justified slavery, and decided who was human and who was less than. Because once you make someone believe their skin isn't holy, you can make them kneel forever. Let's rewind to the heart of that transformation, the Renaissance, the so-called rebirth of art, philosophy, and beauty. But whose rebirth was it really? The truth, it was a rebranding of stolen African science and spirituality into a European aesthetic. Take Michelangelo's Creation of Adam. Everyone knows it. God reaching out to touch man. But look closer. That image was painted after hundreds of years of African depictions showing the same concept. Creation through breath, divine spark through touch. The ancient Kemetic texts called it Ka, the life force passed from God to man. But when Europe copied it, they changed the skin tone, erased the source, and sold it as original. The mind doesn't question what it sees every day. That's how they built control, not through swords, but through symbols. A white angel in the sky, a white Christ on the cross, a white Madonna holding a white baby. That's not religion, that's psychological warfare wrapped in scripture. Because when a black child closes their eyes to pray and can only picture a white face, they're praying to an image that excludes them, and that exclusion becomes identity. It creates shame where pride should be, doubt where divinity should live. That's how you colonize a soul. This wasn't an accident. Missionaries were trained for it. Their job wasn't just to convert, it was to reprogram. They destroyed traditional art, burned ancestral masks, and called them idols. They replaced village shrines with European churches. They made heaven look like Florence, and hell look like Africa. The weapon was never the Bible itself, it was the interpretation. Because inside the same book that justified slavery also lives the verse, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." Egypt, not Rome. The prophets hid in Africa when the world hunted them. The first church was in Ethiopia, not Europe. But they never told that part, did they? Instead, they flipped the narrative. They made Africa the villain. Darkness became the metaphor for evil. Light became the metaphor for salvation. Centuries of art reinforced that, not just in religion, but in language, literature, and education. Think about how deep that runs. The hero wears white, the villain wears black. White lies are harmless. Black markets are criminal. Black magic is evil. White magic is holy. That's not coincidence, that's conditioning. And the conditioning worked. Even colonized Africans started painting angels white. They built churches with European faces on every wall, not realizing they were glorifying the very system that enslaved their ancestors. The masters didn't even need chains anymore. They had imagery. When you control the image, you control the imagination, and imagination shapes destiny. You see this clearly in America. Enslaved Africans were given a Christianity that told them to obey, to wait for heaven while their masters lived in one on earth. They sang songs of freedom while worshiping the image of the people who bound them. That's not just oppression, that's spiritual hypnosis. But some of them saw through it. The spirituals they sang, wade in the water, Swing low, sweet chariot, weren't just prayers, they were codes, hidden messages wrapped in praise. The enslaved had learned to speak the language of the oppressor while still honoring the God of their ancestors. They knew the angel coming to carry me home wasn't a white seraph, it was a black angel, a symbol of liberation. Even under bondage, they held on to the truth that divinity isn't skin deep. But centuries of propaganda buried that truth under layers of guilt and inferiority. By the time the 19th century arrived, art academies taught that the ideal form was white marble, cold, pale, lifeless stone. They called it beauty, but what they were really celebrating was absence. The absence of melanin, the absence of memory, the absence of truth. And that's when black stopped meaning divine and started meaning damned. Psychological warfare had done its job. By turning color into a hierarchy, Europe didn't just shape religion, it shaped civilization itself. White became the measure of progress, intelligence, purity. Black became the backdrop, the contrast that made whiteness shine. That's how racism became theology, and theology became policy. And that ideology spread from pulpits to politics, from Europe to every corner of the colonized world. But here's the twist. The same system that used images to enslave minds is now crumbling because of images too. Social media, archaeology, AI reconstruction, all revealing what ancient art really looked like. Angels with dark skin, prophets with African features, the divine palette restored to its original color. The visual truth is resurfacing, and they can't stop it. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you realize heaven was never pale, hell loses its power. The war for the mind is ending the same way it began, with images. Only this time, the angels look like us again. But this battle didn't just reshape faith, it reshaped history itself. Because after they conquered the spiritual world, they turned their eyes to something even bigger: time. They didn't just rewrite the Bible, they rewrote the timeline. They buried civilizations, renamed kingdoms, and called their own fakes discoveries. That's the next layer of the lie, because once you control time, you erase witnesses. Let's keep it real. Europe wasn't terrified of our skin, they were terrified of our mind, because the deeper they dug into Africa, the more they realized something they could never admit out loud. The people they called primitive had mastered what Europe barely understood: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, spiritual science. That was Africa's language. And the more Europe saw, the more the world's so-called order started to look upside down. Picture this: 15th century explorers landing in Timbuktu, expecting huts and chaos, and instead finding libraries, scholars, gold-covered mosques, maps of the stars drawn centuries before Galileo was even born. They found black scholars fluent in Arabic, Greek, and Latin, men who could quote Aristotle and correct him. It terrified them, because how could they justify colonization, slavery, and Christian civilization if the people they were trying to save were already light years ahead? So they did what conquerors always do when they meet a truth too powerful to control. They buried it. They rewrote the narrative. They flipped the script and called us the Dark Continent. But let's talk about what was really dark. Europe's Middle Ages, the period they themselves called the Dark Ages, was the lowest intellectual point in their history. Famine, plague, war, entire villages wiped out, superstition ruled, the church banned science. People thought disease came from demons. Meanwhile, across Africa, particularly in Mali, Songhai, and Egypt, science, medicine, and philosophy were booming. Scholars were writing thousands of manuscripts, preserving ancient wisdom from Kemet, Kush, and Nubia. Timbuktu alone had over 700,000 manuscripts, medical treatises, astronomy charts, surgical guides, and maps of the universe. Let that sink in. While Europe's doctors were drilling holes in skulls to release spirits, African physicians were performing cataract surgeries with sterilized tools. While Europeans were guessing when to plant crops, Africans had astronomical calendars synced with star movements. While Europe prayed for salvation from disease, African herbalists already knew which plants cured infection. So when Europe came face to face with that, they didn't see ignorance, they saw competition, and competition meant fear, because knowledge is power, and power challenges authority. If the church said, God made Europe to rule, but African civilizations had proof of science, medicine, and philosophy older than Rome, then the entire foundation of white supremacy would crack. That's the secret nobody wants to say out loud. White supremacy was never about superiority. It was about insecurity. The system had to destroy anything that showed African intelligence. That's why libraries were burned, temples raided, sculptures repainted. They didn't just want Africa's gold. They wanted Africa's memory. Even the Greeks, the supposed fathers of Western thought, admitted they learned from Africa. Pythagoras studied geometry in Kemet. Plato studied in Egyptian temples. Herodotus wrote that the Egyptians were black-skinned and woolly-haired. Those are his words, not mine. Yet centuries later, Europeans flipped it. They claimed Greece invented civilization, and somehow made the Egyptians Mediterranean. That's the psychological trick. Take your teacher's knowledge, erase his color, and then call yourself the inventor. But imagine the pressure that comes with that lie. Europe couldn't let the truth resurface. If they did, it would undo centuries of propaganda. It would show the world that the very people they enslaved were the same ones who taught their ancestors how to read the stars. That's why they called African wisdom pagan, why they burned the libraries of Timbuktu, why they looted the temples of Thebes. You see, colonialism wasn't just about land, it was about memory warfare, because when you erase a people's history, you erase their confidence, and when you erase their confidence, you own their future. But here's what's poetic about it. The truth always leaves fingerprints. Fragments survived, scrolls in Ethiopia, manuscripts hidden in Mali, oral traditions passed through griots. Even in the diaspora, enslaved Africans carried coded songs, proverbs, and symbols that kept the knowledge alive. When you hear spirituals or see patterns in African American quilts, you're not just seeing art, you're seeing encrypted messages from ancestors who refuse to forget. That's what terrified Europe most. You can steal the books, but you can't steal the spirit that wrote them. And now, the same knowledge they buried is being uncovered by archaeology, DNA studies, and digital restoration. Manuscripts once buried under desert sand are being digitized. Ancient art, once labeled primitive, is being proven to have mathematical precision. Africa wasn't the student, it was the teacher, and the students lied about the syllabus. But if Africa was the classroom, who were the first students? Who took that knowledge, wore it like armor, and marched it straight into Europe to spark the Renaissance itself? That's where the story turns from defense to domination. Because after centuries of Europe forgetting how to think, it was black scholars who came to remind them. The same Africa they mocked, rebuilt their world, and history never forgave them for it. You know their name, you just don't know their color. The Moors. But who were the Moors really? Here's the part of the story most people trip over, because it upends everything you thought you knew. Europe wasn't saved by kings in castles or monks in monasteries. Europe was saved by black men and women who brought light when the continent thought it was going dark. I'm talking about the Moors, not a vague Muslim invader story they tell in textbooks. Real people, scholars, soldiers, builders, scientists, philosophers, men and women who carried the wisdom of Egypt, Nubia, and West Africa straight into the heart of Europe. When Rome fell, and Europe stumbled into chaos, famine, disease, ignorance, it was the Moors who stepped in. They brought mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture. They built libraries, universities, and hospitals in Al-Andalus, what we now call Spain. Cities like Cordoba and Granada glowed with African knowledge, while Europe froze in superstition. Cordoba had more books than all of Paris at the time. Imagine that. Africa's wisdom, rewritten in Arabic, preserved in libraries, accessible to anyone willing to learn. Meanwhile, Europe's scholars were still praying for survival. These were black scholars who taught Europe what time, space, and numbers really were. They brought algebra, a word derived from Arabic, yes, but the knowledge that came from Africa centuries before. They brought optics, medicine, and engineering. They built aqueducts, bridges, and irrigation systems. They didn't just teach science, they engineered civilization. And when Europe looks back at the so-called Renaissance, they call it their own genius. But the Moors had already laid the blueprint. They had built the library, they had taught the teachers, and they did it while Europe was still figuring out how to farm without superstition getting in the way. And the angels? The same symbolism survived. Moorish architecture is filled with winged motifs, celestial symbols, depictions of divine messengers. Their art echoed African theology, the idea that knowledge, protection, and divinity are inseparable. The Moors carried the faces of black angels into Europe, even when Europe tried to repaint them pale. Here's the kicker. Europe didn't call it African influence, they called it Arab genius, which is partially true, but the roots, the ancestry, the foundation, was African. The Nile, the Sahara, the Sahel, all incubators of knowledge, all erased from the story, and the Europeans, they borrowed, copied, and eventually replaced. They built on what the Moors had saved, rebranded it as their own, and published it in textbooks that still get sold today. Algebra? Check. Medicine? Check. Philosophy? Check. All stolen brilliance, cleaned, and whitened. Yet the Moors didn't just teach science. They brought ethics, law, literature, music, a full civilization. They codified justice systems, preserved libraries, and mentored kings who would later claim discovery of knowledge they never earned. It was so effective that even centuries later, European leaders bragged about their Renaissance, while conveniently forgetting that the world they were reviving had already existed, maintained, taught, and perfected by Africans. And this is where history gets spicy. These same Moors weren't just intellectual giants, they were warriors. They defended Europe from invasions, preserved cities from collapse, and maintained trade networks across Africa, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Their armies, scholars, and artisans didn't just rebuild Europe, they rescued it. Yet when Europe tells the story, you get half a sentence. A vague Moors brought some knowledge. That's it, not the full truth. Because if the world remembered the Moors accurately, the narrative of European superiority collapses entirely. Ask yourself this: why are the Moors almost always described in textbooks as exotic others instead of the architects of an era? Why are black scholars erased from a history they saved? And the truth is, they didn't just save Europe's infrastructure, they saved Europe's faith in itself. By preserving libraries, teaching science, and showing what a functioning civilization looked like, they prevented Europe from forgetting how to think. They were the bridge between Africa's past glory and Europe's borrowed future. And here's where it circles back. Angels, the imagery, the teachings, the divine motifs they carried into Spain, Portugal, and southern France. It's all African. Every halo, every wing, every symbol of divine authority traces back to the same black faces that painted them in Nubia, Ethiopia, and Kemet. Europe tried to bleach that memory white. They tried to tell the story that angels, knowledge, and divine inspiration were European inventions. But the Moors walked into history with receipts, with libraries, with knowledge that couldn't be erased without burning the earth itself. So when you see a white angel on a cathedral ceiling, or a stained glass window, remember this: the blueprint came from Africa. The faces were changed, but the story survived, and the Moors were the ones who carried it into a world that was ready to forget. Here's the question that should shake you. If Africa gave the world its knowledge, its science, its spirituality, and the Moors preserved it, while Europe stumbled in darkness. Then why is Europe celebrated for what Africa built and saved? Because they needed the credit. And centuries later, that lie is still selling textbooks, still shaping minds, still rewriting angels. But the truth can't stay buried forever. Every manuscript, every fresco, every sculpture is a breadcrumb leading back to the original story, to the black angels who never stopped watching over the world. And once you follow that trail, you see something even bigger. The theft didn't stop at Europe. It came to America. It came to the Americas with slavery. It came into churches, schools, and museums. And it left the diaspora searching for the faces of their own divinity. Ask yourself, if the Moors saved Europe, then who saved the memory of the angels for the rest of us? All right. Now we're getting to the heart of it. The evidence you won't find in your high school textbook. The part where the proof stares you in the face, and they still try to convince you it's an illusion. Look at the temples of Kemet. Look at the walls of Nubia. Every pharaoh, every prophet, every priest, black faces staring back at you from stone, gold, and pigment. And not just any black faces, faces full of authority, divine wisdom, and a presence that says, we built this world, and we own this story. Take Pharaoh Taharka of Nubia. He ruled not just one kingdom, but two, Egypt and Kush. His monuments tower over the land, his statues carved from granite, his eyes carved into eternity. Yet when textbooks write about him, he's barely a footnote. They whisper Ethiopian pharaoh, but they hide the fact that he was African royalty, African power, African divinity, incarnate. His armies, his architecture, his reforms. Europe didn't invent that. Africa lived it. Now flip to prophets. Many people think the Bible paints angels and divine messengers as European, but the Ethiopian Bible, the one buried and banned for centuries, tells a different story. The archangels, the seraphim, the watchers, they're described with the skin tones, features, and hair textures of African peoples. These weren't artistic accidents. These were eyewitness accounts of what the divine looked like to the original authors. And it wasn't just text, it was visual. Wall reliefs from Thebes, Nubian pyramids, and Aksumite obelisks show beings with wings, halos, and flowing garments. Angels in armor, angels as guides, angels as protectors, all portrayed as African. You want receipts? Look at the Temple of Philae, Isis and her children. Dark-skinned, powerful, regal. And the wings? Not ornamental, functional, protective, spiritual architecture in motion. And here's the kicker. These images weren't isolated. They appeared across the continent, from Mali to Egypt, Nubia to Ethiopia. The consistency tells you something. This wasn't random. This wasn't art for art's sake. This was a visual language. A language that told the world, divinity is black, wisdom is black, protection is black. Then Europe arrives. Suddenly the images change. The statues lose melanin. The halos get pale. The wings stay, but they float on white faces. That's not evolution. That's erasure. And they were careful. They didn't just repaint the divine. They painted over history. You see it in early Renaissance works, in stained glass windows of Gothic cathedrals. Every angel that looks European is tracing its ancestry back to African originals. Ask yourself, why bleach the angels? Why change the skin? The architecture didn't lie. The sculptures didn't lie. Even the hieroglyphs didn't lie. What they were trying to control was your mind. But here's the most interesting part. Those black angels weren't just symbolic. They were instructional. Look closely at their poses, gestures, and items they hold. Scrolls, staffs, swords, ink symbols, scepters. Each object communicates knowledge, power, and divine authority. The ancient artists were teaching the people about governance, justice, spiritual hierarchy, all through imagery. Europe didn't just steal the stories, they stole the lessons. And this is where it hits personal, because every time we see angels with pale skin today, we internalize it. We imagine divinity as separate from ourselves. We internalize inferiority. They didn't just erase blackness from the past, They made it feel absent in the present, but the visual evidence doesn't lie. It survives in fragments, in sand, in gold, in stone. And the moment you start connecting those fragments, the story becomes undeniable. Black pharaohs, ruling with authority, intelligence, and power. Black prophets, guiding with insight, morality, and divinity. Black angels, protecting, instructing, and inspiring. And here's the twist that hits hardest. These weren't just Africans. These were our ancestors, the very DNA, bloodlines, and legacy that connect directly to the diaspora today. You want proof of who you are? Look at that stone. Look at that manuscript. The faces that Europe tried to whitewash are the faces that run in your veins. Imagine for a second, the angels you've been taught to worship weren't pale, soft, or distant. They were your people. And every time the story was changed, a piece of your memory was stolen. So here's the question that hangs heavy. If the black pharaohs and prophets were the true architects of divinity, who gave Europe the audacity to rewrite God in their image, and if they could do it then, what stories are they still rewriting today? Here's the part of history most people either forget or were never taught. The Moors didn't just teach Europe, they literally saved it. After Rome fell, after the Western Empire crumbled under famine, disease, and ignorance, Europe was stumbling blind. But the Moors arrived with civilization in their hands, not vague helpful scholars, actual engineers, doctors, astronomers, architects, and philosophers. They rebuilt cities, they repaired aqueducts, they opened libraries, so vast, the Europeans hadn't even imagined a library could hold that many books. Cordoba alone had more manuscripts than Paris, London, and Rome combined. And these weren't trivial scrolls. We're talking mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, law, and literature. You ever notice how Europeans love to talk about the Renaissance like it was a sudden spark of genius? That's cute. The blueprint for that so-called genius was handed to them by the Moors. Algebra? They brought it. Surgical techniques? Courtesy of African doctors. Navigational maps? Already charted and taught in Moorish schools. Optics? Astronomy? Philosophy? All meticulously recorded and taught to those Europeans who could understand. And while Europe fumbled through the Dark Ages, the Moors were keeping libraries running, cities functioning, economies alive. They even preserved Greek and Roman texts that Europe had neglected. Without them, much of Europe's knowledge would have been lost forever. The Dark Ages might have been darker than we ever imagined. Architecture tells the same story. Walk through Andalusia, and you see arches, minarets, water systems, and gardens that don't just display beauty, but math, physics, and science in motion. Every structure, every dome, every design element had purpose and knowledge encoded. And the Europeans, they borrowed, adapted, and later erased the origins, calling it Moorish influence, but never naming the African roots. Even music, literature, and philosophy owe a debt to the Moors. They introduced Europe to poetic forms, musical scales, instruments, and philosophical reasoning. They translated Aristotle, Plato, and other Greek philosophers, preserving the works that had almost vanished during Rome's collapse. But they infused them with African and Middle Eastern insights that transformed Europe's understanding of the world. Here's the kicker. While Europe lauded its own rebirth, the Moors were still black, still African, still holding the knowledge of the ancients, and still keeping Europe from total collapse. They didn't just preserve, they created an infrastructure for civilization to survive and grow. And yet, when you read your history book, the Moors are foreign invaders or Muslim occupiers. They're not acknowledged as saviors, engineers, and educators. That's the pattern. Erase the contributions, keep the credit, and sell the lie. Ask yourself this. If the Moors rebuilt Europe, if they taught Europe science, medicine, and governance, then why are they portrayed as outsiders in the story? Why is African ingenuity celebrated only when it's whitened, renamed, and stripped of ancestry? Because Europe couldn't risk telling the truth. Not then, not for centuries. If they had, the narrative of white supremacy would crumble. And centuries later, that lie still lingers, embedded in textbooks, museums, and even popular culture. But the receipts are undeniable. Cordoba's libraries, Granada's aqueducts, Moorish architecture across Spain, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine taught in African classrooms, preserved in Arabic, and later translated to Europe. These are the tangible proofs, the civilization receipts that scream the truth, even when history whispers lies. The Moors didn't just save Europe from collapse, they shaped it, guided it, and prepared it for the Renaissance. A Renaissance they wouldn't be credited for. Every European achievement in science, art, or engineering during that era is built on foundations laid by African minds. And here's the question that cuts deepest. If the Moors had the knowledge and the wisdom to rescue Europe, why do we still believe Europe invented civilization? The evidence is everywhere, but so is the erasure. And the deeper we dig, the more obvious it becomes. Europe didn't rise alone. Africa lifted it, sustained it, and taught it, all while history tried to paint the teachers as outsiders. The truth is in the ruins, the scrolls, and the manuscripts, and it's about time someone read them correctly. Let's cut to the chase. The proof is staring at you from stone, gold, and pigment. If you know where to look, the black pharaohs of Egypt and Nubia weren't anomalies. They were the standard, and their faces, features, and presence tell a story Europe has spent millennia trying to erase. Look at Pharaoh Taharqa, who ruled both Kush and Egypt in the 7th century BCE. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was a warrior king, a scholar, a reformer. His statues tower over time itself, carved in granite so enduring it challenges the centuries. Yet, when you flip open a Western textbook, you might see him referenced in a footnote, stripped of context, depersonalized, diminished. They whisper Ethiopian pharaoh, as if that somehow lessens his claim to history. His armies, his monumental architecture, his reforms, they were African in origin. Yet Europe claims the blueprint as their own when convenient. And it's not just political power. The prophets, the men and women whose words shaped morality, ethics, and law, were African too. The Ethiopian Bible preserves texts that never made it into mainstream Western editions. It describes archangels and divine messengers with dark skin, curly hair, and African features. These aren't metaphors. They're eyewitness accounts from a civilization that knew God intimately and represented divinity through their own reflection. Step closer to the visual record. Walls of Nubian pyramids, temples in Thebes, obelisks in Axum, all display beings with wings, halos, and flowing garments, angels in armor, protectors in motion. In some depictions, wings are functional, not decorative. They're symbolic of authority and divine power, not ornaments. And the black features aren't subtle. They're deliberate, prominent cheekbones, full lips, dark eyes, unmistakably African. Europe saw this, studied it, and then repainted it white. The European angel isn't evolution of artistic style, it's erasure. Every wing, every halo, every gesture was copied, but the skin tone was changed. The divinity was whitened. It's psychological warfare as much as it was aesthetic. And here's the kicker. They weren't just trying to erase the past. They were conditioning generations to question their own divinity. Why does this matter? Because when you internalize that the holy is pale and distant, you start to question your own worth. Every black child raised in a system where divinity is white learns to see themselves as separate from holiness. That's the weapon hidden in the art. That's the subtlety of centuries-long brainwashing. But the proof survives. Fragmented manuscripts, ruined temples, carvings, buried under sand and forgotten tombs. They speak louder than any textbook. They tell the story of black pharaohs, exercising authority with intellect and power. They tell the story of prophets, teaching morality, justice, and spirituality with African features. And they tell us something else. Our ancestors were not just participants in history, they were architects of the divine and the temporal. And here's the emotional hit. These weren't just ancient humans, these were our ancestors. The bloodlines, the DNA, the traditions they carried connect directly to the African diaspora today. Every statue, every manuscript, every fresco is a mirror reflecting us. And yet, for centuries, we were denied our reflection. Now, consider the angels themselves. In early African art, archangels are depicted holding scrolls, scepters, swords, and ankhs. These are not random props. Each object is symbolic of knowledge, governance, protection, and spiritual authority. The artists weren't just creating religious iconography, they were teaching society how to organize, protect, and govern. The angels weren't abstractions, they were living lessons carved in stone. Europe came, saw, and replaced. They didn't just erase black faces from the divine, they stripped the lessons too. They repackaged knowledge, governance, and spiritual instruction into a system they could sell, but stripped of its African origin, and yet the evidence refuses to lie. The faces, the objects, the manuscripts. They survived in Ethiopia, Nubia, Mali, and Egypt. Every rediscovered manuscript, every unpainted wall, every restored relief is a confirmation African divinity existed, black knowledge existed, black power existed, and the world's version of history, it's a carefully curated lie. Now ask yourself this: if the black pharaohs built empires, wrote wisdom, and guided spiritual life, why are they reduced to footnotes? Why are their prophets invisible in Western narratives? Why are the angels that shaped human morality now depicted as European? Because if the world remembered the truth, the entire hierarchy of historical power would collapse. The lie of European superiority isn't just an accident, it's a foundation built on erasing our ancestors from divinity, knowledge, and power. But here's the twist: erasure can only go so far. Every stone, every manuscript, every depiction of a black prophet or angel is a beacon. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know it, the story is no longer theirs to control. And that's the next step. The story of the Moors, the scholars, the warriors who carried this knowledge into Europe itself. They didn't just preserve it, they taught it, lived it, and built the bridges that allowed Europe to rise on African foundations. Ask yourself, if these black pharaohs and prophets were the architects of divinity, who gave Europe the audacity to rewrite God in their own image, and if they could do it then, what stories are they still rewriting today? Let's cut straight to it. History has a color, and it isn't the color of the people who actually built it. Every empire, every library, every civilization that had black faces at the helm, Europe came through and whitened it. Literally, they painted statues, frescoes, and reliefs white. They republished manuscripts, translated texts, and stripped away the African names. They didn't just want the knowledge, they wanted control of the story. Because control the story, control the mind. Take Egypt, for example. Pharaohs ruled for thousands of years. Kings and queens with dark skin, regal posture, divine authority. European scholars, centuries later, said,
Nah, that's not black.
They must have been Mediterranean, or whitewashed in our imagination. Museums displayed the art with European captions. Art history textbooks changed the context. Leaders who were African were called foreign invaders or Moorish occupiers. Entire civilizations became footnotes, while Europe got credit for discoveries. Mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, they only copied. And you better believe it, churches, schools, and governments pushed this story because power loves consistency. You can't enslave a people or dominate a continent if they remember the truth. The psychological layer is brutal. Think about it. For centuries, Africans were sold the narrative that Europe was the source of intelligence, innovation, and divinity. Meanwhile, Europe got to look in the mirror and believe their own superiority was ordained by God. This wasn't accidental. This was calculated. Every classroom lesson, every museum exhibit, every historical novel reinforced a hierarchy designed to keep power in white hands. And it wasn't subtle. The Renaissance? They call it European ingenuity, ignoring that African and Moorish scholars preserved and taught the very knowledge Europe rediscovered. The Bible? Many of the angels you see in stained glass windows were black in the originals, especially in Ethiopian manuscripts, but European artists bleached them for comfort and control. Architecture, bridges, domes, aqueducts, all rebranded as European brilliance when the Moors had built them centuries earlier. Even today, the residue of this manipulation lingers. Hollywood films, textbooks, social media, the erasure continues, shaping who we admire, who we emulate, and how we see our own heritage. When Black history is taught, it's often limited to slavery, oppression, or civil rights. The architects, the scholars, the philosophers, the divine, the Black angels of history are barely mentioned. That's how deep the erasure goes. And it's not just Europe. In America, the whitewashing continued with a vengeance. Churches, schools, and even governments rewrote who created culture, innovation, and spiritual understanding. Every time African achievements are downplayed or misattributed, the pattern repeats. Control the narrative, control the culture, control the people. That's the hidden architecture of power. But here's the real shocker. Evidence survives. Statues with chipped paint revealing Black skin beneath centuries of whitewash. Manuscripts buried in monasteries or desert sands. Oral traditions preserved in African diasporic communities. The truth wasn't destroyed, it was hidden. And now with archaeology, digital restoration, and cultural scholarship, we're peeling back the layers. You see, whitewashing isn't just about paint or translation errors, it's about stealing identity. Every erased face, every misattributed invention, every repainted angel, it's a direct hit on the collective memory of a people. And memory is power. Take that away, and you can shape generations without them realizing it. So here's the question you need to ask. If history is a mirror, whose reflection have you been looking at? And why do so many of us accept a reflection that isn't ours? Because once you see the fingerprints of whitewashing, you can't unsee them. You start noticing it everywhere, in art, in architecture, in religion, in school books, in movies. And once you notice, you begin reclaiming the narrative. The next step is critical, because if whitewashing was the weapon, then knowledge of its existence is the armor. And understanding who truly built civilization, who truly taught Europe, who truly painted the angels, who truly preserved knowledge, is how we start taking it back. Ask yourself this: if Africa, the Moors and Black civilizations were the architects of science, art, and spirituality, then who really controls the story today? And how long have we been living a lie? Let's get one thing straight. Columbus didn't discover anything. He got lost, showed up on someone else's land, and got credit for it. But before his sails ever caught the Atlantic wind, Africans had already crossed that ocean, not as slaves, as sailors, as traders, as teachers. The receipts are heavy. Let's open them up. Centuries before Columbus, African civilizations, particularly from Mali, Carthage, and the Kingdom of Kush, were navigating open waters with ships capable of crossing the Atlantic. The idea that Africans didn't travel far is European propaganda, born out of the need to keep Africa in a primitive box. But look at the evidence, and that box shatters. Start with Emperor Abubakari II of Mali. In the early 1300s, while Europe was still crawling through its so-called Dark Ages, Abubakari ruled one of the richest empires on earth. But he wasn't content with land wealth alone. He wanted to explore. Historical accounts from Arab scholars like Al-Umari record that Abubakari launched not one, but two massive ocean expeditions. The first fleet of 200 ships vanished into the horizon. Most rulers would have stopped there. Not Abubakari. He built a fleet of over 2,000 ships, carrying navigators, builders, and scholars, and set sail across the Atlantic himself. He never came back, but his people did. Carved stones in South America, in Brazil, Mexico, and even the Caribbean show inscriptions in Mande script, the same writing system used in West Africa. Early Spanish explorers noted the presence of black-skinned people already living among the native populations, wearing gold jewelry and weaving patterns identical to those from Mali. Coincidence? The odds are microscopic. These weren't myths, they were memory, and here's what European historians never wanted to admit. Columbus knew Africans had been there first. When he reached the Americas, he wrote in his journals that the people of Hispaniola told him of black men who had come from the south and southeast, trading with spears tipped in gold. He described these spears, and when they were tested, they matched the alloy composition found in West Africa. Let that sink in. This wasn't a one-time voyage. It was a network. Africans traded knowledge, gold, crops, and language. There are similarities in agricultural practices, musical rhythms, and even DNA patterns that connect West Africa to pre-Columbian America. Plantains, yams, and certain varieties of cotton, crops indigenous to Africa, appear in the Americas before European contact. How'd they get there? Boats don't row themselves, but Europeans couldn't allow this narrative, because if Africans had crossed the Atlantic before them, then European discovery collapses into theft. The myth of European brilliance depends on African absence. That's why Abubakari II's story is missing from every Western classroom. That's why pre-Columbian African artifacts found in the Americas are often labeled anomalies or controversial. The system isn't built to integrate truth that destabilizes the lie. Now let's go even deeper. The Olmecs, the earliest known civilization of Mesoamerica, left behind colossal stone heads, some over 10 feet tall, each one carved with broad noses, full lips, and distinctly African features. Archaeologists danced around this for decades, calling them stylized, ambiguous, or symbolic. But go look at one yourself. There's nothing ambiguous about them. They look like the brothers from Mali. Even the architecture shows connection. The stepped pyramids of the Olmecs mirror the ziggurats of Nubia. The alignment of temples with celestial patterns, same methodology, same precision. These were shared ideas, shared mathematics, carried across oceans by people who understood the currents long before European maps even existed. But you might be asking, if Africans reached the Americas, why isn't there more evidence? Because Europe made sure to burn it. Columbus and the conquistadors didn't explore, they erased. They burned indigenous libraries, destroyed carvings, and rewrote oral traditions into colonial myths. What's left are fragments, but those fragments tell a consistent story. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Africans didn't just arrive in America, they influenced it. They traded, settled, taught, and merged cultures. And when Columbus came, he didn't discover, he disrupted. He brought the end of a chapter that had already been written in black ink. But think about the psychological power in that. If African people were capable of crossing oceans, establishing trade, and sharing knowledge, centuries before Europe could even navigate its own coastlines, what does that say about who the true innovators were? What does that say about the story we've been told? Every map, every textbook, every painting of a brave European explorer is propaganda designed to bury that truth, to make you believe you were always the conquered, never the discoverer. But when you know this, when you really know this, it changes how you see yourself. You realize you come from a lineage of navigators, thinkers, and builders whose reach was global. And yet, one question still burns. If the world knew that Africans crossed the ocean before Columbus, if the evidence is there in stone, soil, and scripture, why does the lie still hold? Why are our children still taught discovery, as if it's theft in disguise. Maybe it's because once the lie falls, so does the empire that built it. Now we get to the part of history that really makes you mad. The part where you realize the so-called genius of Europe is mostly borrowed brilliance, stolen, repackaged, and sold as their own. And the original owners, forgotten, erased, demonized. Let's start with paper. You think paper came from China? That's only half the story. The techniques for making paper, parchment, and codices traveled from Africa, from Egypt and Nubia, to the Mediterranean, then to Europe. Ancient Egyptians wrote on papyrus thousands of years before Rome or Greece got the memo. They recorded astronomy, medicine, mathematics, literature, all preserved in these sheets. And when Europe discovered paper centuries later, they acted like they invented it. Libraries, schools, entire civilizations could have collapsed if African knowledge hadn't been preserved. And yet, credit not given. Medicine is another stolen chapter. Egyptian and Nubian physicians were treating diseases, performing surgeries, and documenting herbal remedies centuries before European universities existed. Imhotep, the architect and healer, was later turned into a mythical figure by Western historians. African medical texts were translated into Arabic, then Latin, then finally taught in European universities, often with the African origin erased. Want proof? Surgical techniques used in the Renaissance, and even into modern Europe, were identical to those documented in ancient African manuscripts. Ask yourself, if Africa had developed these methods first, why does history act like Europe discovered them? Navigation. This one hits close to home. The Moors and West African mariners didn't just sail locally, they charted stars, tides, and ocean currents with precision. They crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus. Instruments like the astrolabe and complex maps were used in African ports to guide ships safely across oceans. Europeans learned, copied, and eventually patented these techniques as if they were their own. And the map of the world, shaped by African navigators who were never allowed to sign their names. Martial arts too. You ever hear of African fighting techniques influencing Europe and Asia? It's true, African combat systems, strikes, holds, footwork, were adopted by mercenaries, armies, and even royal guards, but the lineage wiped from the books. Now it's European, or Asian, martial arts. Your ancestors' movements, passed down for centuries, were quietly rebranded. And here's the sickest part, it wasn't accidental. Every stolen invention, every borrowed technique, was an act of power, because knowledge is power. If you control who invents what, who teaches what, and who records it, you control society itself. By erasing Africa's contributions, the world learned to bow to Europe, not because Europe was superior, but because Europe owned the story of superiority. But the truth leaves a trail. The pyramids, the irrigation systems, the navigation records, medical manuscripts, all point back to African ingenuity. You don't need theory, you need eyes to see, and minds to connect the dots. And once you do, you can't unsee it. Now consider this psychologically. Generations of people were taught that intelligence, innovation, and civilization came from Europe, yet all the receipts point the other way. That dissonance is intentional. It's designed to make us doubt ourselves, to forget our ancestry, to internalize inferiority. That's the weapon of stolen history. But knowledge has a way of surviving. Oral traditions, hidden manuscripts, artifacts in museums, mislabeled as unknown origin, all of it is proof. And when you piece it together, a pattern emerges. Africa wasn't just a contributor. Africa created the baseline. Every European discovery, every Renaissance achievement, every modern innovation traces its roots back to African minds. Ask yourself, if Africa invented paper, medicine, navigation, and martial arts long before Europe could claim them, then who really owns civilization? And if Europe had to steal to appear great, what does that say about the system we've been taught to admire? And here's the twist. The theft didn't just enrich Europe. It erased Africa from its own story, leaving the diaspora wandering without anchors, searching for proofs of genius that were always there. Every stolen innovation is a reminder the world owes us, and it doesn't want to admit it. So what happens when you finally connect the receipts? When you realize that African civilizations didn't just influence the world, they built it, and every European claim is built on African foundations. That's the revelation, and it's only the beginning, because next we move into the realm they tried hardest to erase, the biblical truths they buried, the black prophets, the Ethiopian scriptures, the angels who were never white. Here's where it gets heavy. The Bible. The sacred text millions claim is truth, yet the story we've been taught has been rewritten, repainted, and repackaged for centuries. And what's hidden in plain sight is simple. The prophets were black. The angels were black. The divine itself reflected African features, and Europe buried it. Let's start with the Ethiopian Bible, also called the GA's Bible. It predates most Western versions and preserves books that were excluded from the King James Bible. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and others that tell a very different story about creation, divinity, and morality. And here's the kicker. The descriptions of angels, seraphim, and messengers align perfectly with African imagery. Bronze-toned faces, dark skin, and curly hair, features erased in European depictions. And this wasn't some stylistic choice, it was testimony. The writers described what they saw. Take Enoch, for example. His visions described the archangels standing in awe-inspiring power, their skin like burnished bronze, wings stretching wide, eyes shining like fire. They weren't the soft, delicate European angels we see in stained glass windows today. These angels were warriors, protectors, teachers. They were African, and they carried authority, knowledge, and divine law. Then there are the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all rooted in the context of African and Middle Eastern civilizations. The Ethiopian texts preserve names, lineages, and events that tie them directly to Kushite and Nubian societies. And yet, in most Western theology, their images have been whitewashed, their teachings abstracted, their power softened to make them palatable for a European audience. Ask yourself, why repaint God in European skin? Why erase the ancestry of the divine? Because if people believed that divinity reflected them, that God, angels, and prophets were black, it would disrupt centuries of control. It would undo the narrative that positioned Europe as the pinnacle of civilization. Every whitewashed angel, every repackaged prophet, is a psychological tool designed to keep people distant from their own power. And this erasure isn't subtle. Look at early European art. Every biblical scene, with Moses, Joseph, or the shepherds, is recast as pale and European. The Ethiopian Bible says one thing, European cathedrals say another, and the average person, they trust the cathedral art over the manuscripts, hidden in Africa for centuries. That's the power of narrative control. But here's the part most people miss. These weren't just spiritual figures, they were educators, advisors, and leaders. Their stories were models for governance, justice, and morality. When Europe whitewashed the prophets, they weren't just changing skin tone, they were rewriting ethical authority. They were telling the world, intelligence, leadership, and divine favor belong to someone else. And don't forget the angels again. The ones that guided, protected, and taught humanity were black. In the Ethiopian manuscripts, their roles are clear, enforcing justice, instructing kings, guarding sacred knowledge. Every European painting that turns them pale is a deliberate inversion of reality. This isn't art, this is historical manipulation. The implications for the diaspora are huge. When generations of African-descended people are raised on whitewashed images of divinity, it fractures identity. It conditions reverence for whiteness, even when it contradicts the truth of ancestry. And it perpetuates the myth that African people were never architects of culture, science, or morality. But the receipts survive, hidden in monasteries, preserved in Jeze manuscripts, embedded in oral traditions, and reflected in ancient art across Ethiopia, Nubia, and Egypt. The truth waits for those willing to see it. The prophets, the angels, the sacred history, all black, all foundational. And every erasure is a reminder of what they tried to take from us. Here's the twist. If the prophets and angels were African, if the Ethiopian Bible preserves truths erased elsewhere, then what else have they hidden? What stories, what knowledge, what power was deliberately kept from sight to shape the world? And more importantly, what happens when we reclaim it? Because once you start seeing the divine as black, once you accept that the creators, the messengers, the teachers were your ancestors, the way you see history, yourself, and the world changes forever. The next step is psychological. We need to understand why they buried it, how this erasure shaped minds, and what happens when a people forget their own story. Let's get deep now, beyond archaeology, beyond scripture, into the mind, because this isn't just about stolen art or missing chapters in a Bible. This is about memory. When a people are cut off from their divine image, from their historical reflection in the sacred, the result isn't just ignorance, it's identity amnesia. See, colonization wasn't just about land, it was about belief. The most powerful weapon wasn't a sword or a gun, it was the image. Change the image of God, and you change the image of man. Make the divine look like you, and you make yourself the authority. Erase someone's reflection from divinity, and you make them believe they are beneath it. That's the true theft. Psychological colonization. When enslaved Africans were forced into Christianity in the Americas, they were handed images of white saints and pale-skinned angels. The message was subtle, but surgical. This is holy, this is good, this is God. And what's not white, what's African, was labeled heathen, primitive, dark. That conditioning didn't just control bodies, it rewired the soul. And this is why the rediscovery of the black angels, the black prophets, the African divine, is so threatening to the systems built on control. Because once people realize they were looking at their own faces all along, that heaven reflected them, the hierarchy collapses. Let's talk about the science of it for a second. Psychologists call it symbolic annihilation. It's what happens when a group never sees themselves positively represented in media, education, or religion. Over time, it internalizes inferiority. You start believing that greatness belongs elsewhere, that you can't be chosen, divine, or visionary. That's what centuries of Eurocentric theology did to the African world. Think about it. If the angels are white, the prophets are white, Jesus is white, and even God himself is white, then where does that leave the black child in Sunday school? They're taught to worship a reflection that doesn't include them, to seek salvation in an image that erases them. That's not spirituality, that's psychological warfare, dressed as religion. And here's the cruel irony. The earliest Christians weren't Europeans at all. They were Africans and Middle Easterners, the first Christian nations, Ethiopia and Nubia, long before Rome ever claimed the cross. But that history gets buried, the art gets repainted, and generations grow up thinking salvation came from Europe, not through Africa. So what happens when a people forget their reflection in the divine story? They lose confidence in their purpose. They become easier to control, easier to divide, easier to market to, easier to enslave mentally. Because power doesn't need chains when it has belief. But here's the turning point, the return of knowledge. The internet, archaeology, and the rediscovery of suppressed texts are pulling the curtain back. Young black people across the diaspora are seeing ancient depictions of winged warriors with Nubian features. They're reading the Ethiopian Bible and realizing how much of it was deliberately left out. They're reclaiming the names of ancestors once labeled myth. That's where healing starts. Because memory, collective memory, is resistance. Every time you see yourself in history, every time you call out the whitewashing, you're not just correcting a textbook, you're repairing a wound that's centuries old. You're taking back divine imagery, one truth at a time. And that's why this story matters, not for nostalgia, not for revenge, but for restoration. Restoration of self, faith, and truth. Because if you don't know where the image came from, You can't know where you came from. Let's not pretend it'll be easy. Systems built on erasure don't fall quietly, but history is louder now than ever before. The paintings are being reinterpreted. The manuscripts are being translated. The angels, once hidden in African hues, are stepping back into the light. And when they do, when the world finally accepts that the divine was never pale, the psychological chains break. Because the mind is the last battlefield, and reclaiming your reflection in the sacred is the ultimate act of revolution. That's the story, the healing they never wanted told. Now let's get real. Understanding the erasure is one thing. Seeing it survive despite everything, that's another. The truth is, Africa and its diaspora didn't just vanish under colonialism, slavery, and cultural theft. They fought. They resisted. They survived. And their survival is a masterclass in resilience and genius that history textbooks will never tell you. Take Ethiopia, the only African nation never colonized by Europe, not because of luck, but because they had strategy, intelligence, and sheer force. Leaders like Emperor Menelik II didn't just defend their borders, they rewrote the playbook on warfare. The Battle of Adwa in 1896 wasn't a fluke. Ethiopian soldiers used modern rifles, strategic ambushes, and superior knowledge of the terrain to defeat an Italian army trying to impose European rule. The victory wasn't just military, it was symbolic. It sent a message. Africa could resist, Africa could survive, and Africa could win. Then look at Benin. The Kingdom of Benin thrived for centuries with incredible sophistication. Its art, architecture, and governance rivaled Europe's best, yet it was almost completely destroyed by British forces in the 19th century. The British looted bronze sculptures, royal artifacts, and cultural treasures, some of which are only now being repatriated. But Benin's memory survived through oral history, through the diaspora, through art that even stolen could not erase. The Edo people preserved identity through storytelling, city planning, and artistry. That's how survival works. It adapts, it hides, it waits. Mali, too. The Mali Empire at its height under Mansa Musa wasn't just wealthy, it was intellectually rich. Timbuktu's libraries housed tens of thousands of manuscripts on medicine, astronomy, law, and spirituality. When European explorers arrived, they found schools and universities older than anything in Europe. But colonizers called it primitive. They looted texts, burned libraries, and renamed cities, trying to erase what they couldn't control. Still, the manuscripts survived, often hidden in mosques, private collections, and underground vaults. The knowledge endured, like embers waiting to reignite. And the diaspora, Chiti, is the ultimate example. Enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic in chains, yet they refused to accept subjugation as destiny. In 1791, they revolted, not just against French colonists, but against the entire system of European-imposed slavery. Leaders like Toussaint Louverture built an army, negotiated diplomacy, and established the first black republic in the modern world. Chiti's revolution is proof. African knowledge, leadership, and resilience could not be erased by force, fire, or propaganda. Here's the pattern, if you're paying attention. Wherever African people went, they adapted, resisted, and preserved knowledge. Even under extreme oppression, traditions survived. In language, religion, spiritual practices, art, and governance. African identity wasn't wiped out. It was buried, sometimes underground, but never extinguished. And that's why the diaspora today still carries these legacies, whether people know it or not. But survival isn't just about clinging to the past, it's about translating that legacy into power in the present. The African kingdoms didn't just resist for themselves, they created systems that taught generations how to strategize, to organize, to govern. Timbuktu's libraries weren't just knowledge repositories, they were power. Ethiopia's military victories weren't just defense, they were blueprints for autonomy. Chiti's revolution wasn't just a revolt, it was proof that enslaved knowledge and skill could overthrow entire empires. Now consider the psychological angle. For centuries, colonizers tried to convince African people and their descendants that survival was impossible, that resistance was futile, that the world was built without them, that their history didn't matter. And yet these examples scream the opposite. They remind us that memory, culture, and identity are stronger than oppression. And when you connect those dots, the idea of power shifts. You see the diaspora, not as victims, but as inheritors of strategy, knowledge, and divinity. Here's the truth they hope you never see. Resistance wasn't always about open battle. Sometimes it was subtle. Language preservation, ritual practices, storytelling, and communal memory. These were ways to protect identity. Every song, every proverb, every ceremony carried a map of survival, a lesson in adaptation, and a blueprint for reclaiming sovereignty. And that's why, even today, African-descended people carry echoes of these systems in music, religion, art, and social organization. And here's the kicker: modern systems of oppression, media control, and narrative manipulation still try to obscure these victories. Schools still gloss over Haiti, museums still hide Benin bronzes, textbooks still sanitize Ethiopia. But survival, by its nature, is persistent. Every time someone researches, writes, speaks, or teaches truth, the legacy resurfaces. That's why stories like these are explosive, because they challenge the centuries-long lie that African people were passive or powerless. Now ask yourself, if African nations survived colonization, preserved knowledge, and even built revolutions under impossible circumstances, why does the narrative still insist on black inferiority? And more importantly, what happens when the diaspora fully reconnects with that survival knowledge, not just as history, but as a blueprint for empowerment today? That's the bridge to the modern era, because the same ingenuity, spirituality, and resilience that kept Ethiopia, Benin, Mali, and Haiti alive can now be applied to reclaim culture, economics, and global influence. The question is, will we recognize the blueprints, or continue to let history's erasers define our identity? Every monument, manuscript, and story of resistance isn't just proof of survival, it's a call to action. And the next chapter is about modern echoes, how media, culture, and institutions continue to control the narrative, even today, and how the diaspora can break free. Here's the thing: they didn't stop with textbooks and museums. The control didn't end when empires fell. The erasure evolved. Today, it's not just history that's been whitewashed, it's culture, identity, and even aspiration. Modern media became the new battlefield, and mental chains replaced iron ones. Turn on a TV, scroll social media, or watch a blockbuster film, and ask yourself, who is celebrated? Who is framed as intelligent, heroic, or aspirational? Who gets to embody genius, divinity, or leadership? Odds are, the answer looks European, again, because the same centuries-old playbook applies: control the image, control the mind, subtle, relentless, invisible, and effective. Music, fashion, literature, all arenas where African innovation is front and center, are often stripped of context. Jazz, hip-hop, Afrobeat, even modern technology. African contributions are admired, but rarely fully credited. Even when acknowledged, the narrative is framed as if it was inevitable, accidental, or derivative of Western culture. That's the psychological trick. It lowers pride, raises doubt, and keeps the hierarchy intact. Education mirrors the same pattern. Textbooks gloss over African empires. Standardized tests teach colonial perspectives as universal truths. Children grow up celebrating European conquest as brilliance, while African achievement is a footnote. And the effect: a collective inferiority complex, a default worship of whiteness, a learned deference to narratives that were designed to erase power from their own lineage. Even religion is affected. Churches continue to showcase whitewashed depictions of Jesus, saints, and angels. Sunday school lessons, Sunday sermons, and popular iconography reinforce centuries of visual deception. The subtle but powerful message, divinity isn't like you, it doesn't reflect you, and if God isn't like you, then greatness certainly isn't either. Social media compounds this problem. Algorithms prioritize content that reflects Eurocentric ideals of beauty, intelligence, and culture. Memes, films, and advertisements subtly reward conformity to these ideals, punishing deviation. This creates an invisible cage, one where identity and self-worth are mediated through a lens of centuries-old erasure, and most people don't even notice. But here's the silver lining: knowledge is leaking. The internet, podcasts, independent media, and grassroots education projects are chipping away at the lie. Young Black creators are showing the truth. Black excellence didn't start yesterday. Black angels existed. Black prophets existed. African civilizations weren't lost. They were stolen from the narrative. And the diaspora is starting to see itself reflected, not in distortion, but in fact. Mental liberation begins with awareness. Once people see the fingerprints of historical manipulation on modern culture, everything changes. Suddenly, missed opportunities for pride, education, and agency are no longer personal failings. They're the result of centuries of erasure. That shift is dangerous to those who built the lie, because empowered people don't just consume culture, they reshape it, reclaim it, and demand recognition for the truth. And that's why media control persists. The systems know that knowledge is power, but the leaks are everywhere. Documentary channels, independent publishers, YouTube storytellers, and social media historians revealing African achievements, Moors' influence in Europe, and the pre-Columbian voyages of Africans. The same narratives they tried to erase are resurfacing, often with more reach than ever before. Here's the kicker: this isn't just nostalgia or history trivia, it's mental sovereignty. When African-descended people reclaim their ancestral contributions, when they see themselves in the prophets, the engineers, the navigators, the scholars, it rewires self-perception. Pride replaces doubt, knowledge replaces myth, and the chains, which were once invisible, begin to snap. And the question you have to ask yourself is simple: if media, religion, and education have been used as tools of psychological manipulation for centuries, then what happens when those tools are flipped, when the truth is amplified, and the erased voices dominate the conversation? How powerful could the diaspora become if it reclaims not just memory, but cultural narrative, economic influence, and intellectual authority? Every time a young person learns the true history, every time the Black angels are recognized, every time African contributions to science, navigation, and philosophy are taught, the chain breaks a little more. And every time the chain breaks, the blueprint becomes clearer. Africa didn't fail, it was hidden, but the knowledge survived, and now it's ours to wield. So here's the cliffhanger: the tools of erasure are still around, but the tools of reclamation are stronger than ever. Digital media, scholarship, community activism, these are the weapons of a new generation, ready to reclaim the past and reshape the future. Next up, we go even deeper into reclaiming the blueprint itself, because knowledge without action is just information. How do we take all this history, all this survival, all this genius, and make it a foundation for today? Now we arrive at the part where history stops being something that happened to us and starts being something we own. This is the blueprint, the map, the knowledge, the lineage that was stolen, hidden, or erased. And now, it's time to reclaim it, because power isn't just remembering the past. Power is using it to shape the present and the future. Reclaiming the blueprint begins with knowledge. It starts by seeing African history for what it truly is, a record of brilliance, innovation, and leadership. From the Moors who rebuilt Europe, to the Black angels in Scripture, to the navigators who crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus, the receipts are everywhere. And every receipt we uncover is a blow against the centuries of lies that told us otherwise. But knowledge alone isn't enough. Reclamation demands culture. It demands that we live the history we discover. Music, art, literature, fashion, education, these aren't just personal expressions, they're vessels for revival. Every time African-descended people celebrate their heritage, they reinforce the truth. We are not just descendants of survivors. We are heirs of innovators, warriors, and divine visionaries. Take language, for example. Preserving African dialects, reconnecting with ancestral languages, or even simply understanding the etymology of words we use today, reveals the depth of our influence. Every phrase, every cadence, every rhythm of speech carries fragments of that survival knowledge. Language is a living blueprint, a bridge between the past and the future. Art, too, is critical. The images we create today, murals, photography, digital media, can rewrite the narrative that centuries of whitewashing attempted to erase. The aesthetic decisions we make, the stories we tell through visuals, echo the same principles that once guided African kingdoms and civilizations. The palette, the symbolism, the storytelling, it all connects us to a lineage that refuses to be erased. Education is the next frontier. Independent research, community-led classes, and platforms that teach African contributions to science, philosophy, mathematics, and spirituality are revolutionary acts. Knowledge is power, yes, but teaching it amplifies that power exponentially. When the next generation sees themselves in history, not as footnotes, but as architects, they inherit a sense of capability and destiny that can't be bought or stolen. Reclaiming the blueprint also means reinterpreting faith, understanding that black angels, prophets, and sacred figures reflect our own image, restores spiritual authority. It dismantles the internalized inferiority imposed by centuries of erasure. When divinity reflects us, when morality and leadership are connected to our lineage, we realize that greatness is inherent, not borrowed. And then comes the economic and structural awakening. Reclaiming the blueprint isn't just cultural or spiritual, it's practical. African ingenuity in agriculture, trade, engineering, navigation has always been advanced. Reintegrating these methods into modern contexts empowers communities to innovate, lead, and thrive independently. The blueprint includes strategies for organization, resilience, and sustainability that are relevant today. But here's the real power move. Reclamation is collective. This isn't about individual pride alone. It's about shared empowerment. Every reclaimed story, every restored artifact, every truth spoken in the open builds a network of identity, history, and influence. It's a chain reaction. Knowledge passed from one community to another reignites cultural confidence, which strengthens social cohesion, economic resilience, and political influence. And here's the kicker. The blueprint isn't static. It grows as we apply it. Every discovery in history, every recovered manuscript, every unveiled artifact becomes a tool for modern application. Every time we see the Black Angels, the Moors, the African navigators, not just as figures of the past, but as models for strategy, morality, and leadership, we turn memory into action. That's what makes this reclamation revolutionary. So ask yourself, what would the world look like if every African-descended person fully internalized the blueprint? If every community, from local neighborhoods to global diasporic networks, reclaimed history, art, science, and spirituality as their own? Could we reshape global culture, education, and even geopolitics with the truths they tried so hard to erase? This is why the blueprint matters. It isn't just nostalgia. It isn't just academic curiosity. It's a manual for empowerment. It's a guide for the mind, the spirit, and the community. And every truth we reclaim, every angel, every prophet, every innovation, is a spark that lights a path forward. The only thing left to imagine is a world where nothing was forgotten, a world where the stolen history is restored, the erased identities are recognized, and the knowledge of ancestors informs every choice, every innovation, every vision for the future. That's where we go next, to the vision of what could have been and what still can be. Imagine for a second a world where none of this was erased. Imagine if every story, every angel, every prophet, every innovation, had survived intact. Imagine if African brilliance, African leadership, African divinity had always been taught as it actually happened. The world would look completely different, wouldn't it? And more importantly, we would look different. Think about the impact. Children wouldn't grow up questioning their worth. They would see themselves reflected in history, in science, in philosophy, in spirituality. They wouldn't have to fight internalized doubt because the world already acknowledged their ancestors' genius. Imagine walking into a classroom and seeing a black Enoch, depicted as he was described, commanding, radiant, wise. Imagine maps filled with African navigators, charting oceans centuries before Columbus. Imagine textbooks acknowledging that Timbuktu's libraries once rivaled the greatest institutions of Europe. That knowledge would shape a generation. That identity would be unbreakable. Now think bigger. If we never forgot, our sense of possibility wouldn't be limited by centuries of psychological manipulation. Leadership, governance, innovation, art, all of it would be informed by centuries of African mastery. Africa wouldn't be developing in the eyes of the world. Africa would be leading, teaching, inspiring. And the diaspora, we wouldn't be chasing breadcrumbs of lost culture. We would be building on the foundation our ancestors already laid, with full knowledge of the blueprint. And here's the fire. If the world always knew this truth, the entire narrative of power would shift. Colonialism, slavery, and the whitewashing of history wouldn't just be morally bankrupt, they'd be intellectually bankrupt. Lies would be exposed. The systems built to control perception, manipulate belief, and steal legacy would crumble under the weight of truth. People who've long claimed superiority would have to reckon with receipts, tangible, undeniable proof that African civilizations were the blueprint for much of the modern world. But even without the world catching up, we can remember. Reclaiming memory, identity, and spiritual lineage is ours to do, individually and collectively. Every text read, every manuscript translated, every story told, every angel recognized, is a step toward that world that could have been. And each step strengthens us in ways they could never erase. The emotional weight of it hits hard. Pride, joy, anger, and resolve all at once. Because when you understand the depth of what was stolen, the civilizations, the divine representations, the innovations, it's impossible to feel small. That's the awakening. That's the moment where doubt can't survive. That's the recognition that greatness wasn't given to us. It was never taken from us. It just had to be remembered. And there's a spiritual layer to this too. Seeing the black angels, the prophets, the divine as reflections of our ancestors restores more than memory. It restores a sacred connection to the universe, to creation, and to purpose. It's a reclamation of soul. Every erasure attempted to separate us from that energy. And yet, here we are, reconnecting centuries later. That's power. That's liberation. Now ask yourself, if you could carry this truth into your life, into your community, your work, your family, how would it change the way you move through the world? If every African descended person understood that they descend from architects of knowledge, builders of empires, and bearers of divine reflection, could we finally live free of the mental chains imposed on us for centuries? Could we rewrite the world not just with resistance, but with innovation, leadership, and spiritual clarity? That's the vision, not just of history reclaimed, but of futures reshaped. A world where nothing was forgotten, where power isn't inherited from theft, but remembered from truth, where African brilliance is not an exception in textbooks, but the foundation of every story told. Imagine that world, the pride, the clarity, the unshakable sense of identity. So here's the final awakening. The black angels weren't myths. The prophets weren't fiction. The civilizations weren't accidental. They were real, brilliant, and undeniable. And we don't have to wait for the world to recognize it. The awakening begins in us. It begins in recognition. It begins in action. It begins when we honor what was always ours. History tried to hide it. Religion tried to sanitize it. Media tried to distort it. But the truth survived. And when we finally embrace it, fully, unapologetically, it ignites something unstoppable. Pride, that cannot be erased, identity that cannot be broken, power that cannot be denied. Ask yourself one last time, if we never forgot, if we always remembered, what heights could we reach? Because the blueprint was never lost. It's been waiting for us to see, to claim, to rise.